And more importantly, ladies and gentlemen, this discussion we're going to have today couldn't fall on a better anniversary than Mother's Day weekend, because as the old saying goes, folks, the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And there are powerful people who understand that theme very well, which is why motherhood is so much under the gun these days. The whole concept of motherhood, the whole concept of femininity, the dignity that comes with being a woman, and of bringing life into the world, and more importantly, not just bringing life into the world, but cultivating that life so that society can be built. This is something that we in the West no longer value or treasure or anything like that, and that is going to be the topic of today's discussion. Now, I am joined by two very important and interesting individuals, one of whom is a semi-regular co-host of this program, and that is Mark Dankoff, not a stranger to any of you out there. The other, our guest today, ladies and gentlemen, wrote or actually what he did is he put on a particularly brilliant speech at a gathering in Houston dealing with the topic that we're going to be discussing here. And after having read this, I said, this is so important to discuss. There's no way that we can understand why we find ourselves now in 2 or 3, maybe 4 wars, hot wars around the world, in the parts of the world where we are to be found, without understanding some of the finer and what I would consider to be the more subtle and covert aspects of how we got ourselves into this mess. Having said that, I'm going to go ahead and bring up my two esteemed gentlemen, one of whom, as I said, is Mark Dankoff, and the other is E. Michael Jones, who is the editor of Culture Wars magazine, which you can at least look at by going to culturewars.com. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on the program, and welcome.
Thank you, Mark.
Good to be here.
Well, it's good to have you. You heard my introduction, fellas, and the discussion for today's program is warfare. Dr. Jones, the name of your magazine is Culture Wars. I notice you didn't call it culture conflict or culture discussions or culture questions. There is a war going on for culture, and we're not just talking about Christian culture. We're talking about things that just about every society in the world would consider to be, we're going to put right on one side and we're going to put wrong on the other. It is being assaulted. All culture in that respect is being assaulted. I assume that you would agree with me on that.
Yeah, we're going way back to the beginning of civilization. If you want to talk about civilization in any sense, let's take Greek civilization. Euripides wrote a play called the Bacchae, or the Bacchant Women, about what happens when the god Dionysus, who is the god of sexual excess and intoxication, what happens when Dionysus arrives in Thebes? Well, what happens is the women leave their looms and they go and they dance naked on the mountainside. Mm-hmm. And Pentheus, who's the king of Thebes, understands and says, no culture can survive when this happens. Mm-hmm. The city's going to fall. The city is doomed if this happens. Mm-hmm. In other words, the civilization is based on the sexual morality of women in particular. Mm-hmm. So Pentheus decides, I'm going to put an end to this. I'm going to capture Dionysus. So he captures Dionysus, brings him before him, and Dionysus says basically, no, I've got you. And the king says, what do you mean you've got me? I've got you. And he says, no. He says, would you like to see the women dance naked on the mountainside? And Pentheus says, well, yeah. As a matter of fact, I would. So we have this moment where the king, who is the principle of order in this culture, mm-hmm. is subverted by his own weakness, his own sexual weakness. And we all have this sexual weakness, and there are subverters out there. And so what happens is that Dionysus makes him put on a dress, so he loses all authority. He walks through town wearing a dress. He goes out, and when he gets to the mountainside where the women are dancing, Dionysus says, climb a tree, you'll see better. So he climbs a tree. The women see him. They go and tear him limb from limb, drag him down, tear him apart. And then they have this powerful end to this play, which is the beginning of civilization, our civilization. And there's this woman who is sitting on center stage, and she's got Pentheus's head in her lap. Turns out that this is his mother, who is going crazy with this Dionysian frenzy. And then her father comes in, and he says to Agave, the woman, "What do you see?" And Agave says, "It's a trophy. It's a lion's head." And then he says, "No, look again. What do you see?" And at this moment, you can see the intoxication wearing off, this Dionysian intoxication wearing off. And she looks down and she utters this line. She says, "I see horror. I see suffering. I see grief." And I'm saying that's our moment right now. That's the moment when the Dionysian intoxication of the 60s is wearing off, and we're waking up. I mean, we're waking up having some people have aborted their children, some people have diseases, some people have ruined their lives, but there's this moment of sobriety that I think is setting in now, and I think that's the moment we have to capitalize on, and that's sort of what I wanted to talk about in Houston.
Well, I would slightly disagree with you, Doctor, in the sense that the intoxication is wearing off. From my own personal experience as a father of 9 children, 5 of whom are females, that my wife and I pay particular attention as to how they carry themselves in public, and of course, having to constantly shield our sons' eyes and ears from what they run into when they are out in this quote-unquote Christian country. The other day I had somebody send me, providentially I guess, in a sick sense, a link to a video, and he said, "You've got to see this. This woman is the newest sensation in the rock business," and her name is Lady Gaga, and I had heard of Lady Gaga and remembered her name only in the sense that I thought to myself, what kind of a self-respecting artist would come up with such a stupid name as this? And so I clicked on the video and started watching this, and before it had even started playing, I looked down at the counter. This was the official video, the YouTube video. It had 400 million downloads. That's almost 500 million people. That exceeds the population of the United States. Okay? And watched the video, and I thought to myself, this is what our kids are watching? I mean, this woman, she's supposed to be the biggest thing now since Madonna and Britney Spears, and this video was nothing less than what would have been considered a soft porn video when the 3 of us were teenagers. And so I would agree with you, Dr. Jones, in the sense that there may be some sobriety that is setting in. But in general, I think that the well is being more and more poisoned every day with this intoxicant, as you put it, and it doesn't seem to me, other than maybe the baby boomers now who realize that they have no grandchildren sitting at their knee because, as you pointed out, they've either aborted their own children or they have passed down this tradition to their own children, so that they are left without grandchildren. Other than that, the young people seem to be just skating along just fine with this. What do you say about that?
I think that there are moments. I mean, it's not something where you can add up numbers. I think there are cultural moments of sobriety. And I did a book on one of them. One of the books I did is Monsters from the Id, which is basically about how horror movies are a reaction to sexual liberation. I mean, slasher movies are a moment of sobriety. And that's produced by Hollywood itself. The reaction has to set in. I mean, what is the message of a slasher movie? Like, say something like Halloween that came out in 1978, and Alien, which I think is a really important movie. What is the message of these movies? The message is, if you take off your clothes and have sex with your boyfriend, somebody's going to jump out of the bushes and kill you. You're going to die. Alien is even worse. Alien is the reaction to the 70s of sex. I mean, what is the message of a movie like Alien, a horror movie? Sex is dangerous. Sex will kill you. And the culture produces these moments in spite of itself. And obviously the forces that we're talking about here, that I talked about in Houston, they haven't gone away. They haven't been defeated, but I think there's a moment of awakening that happens, time and time again. I think we're in a moment like that.
Mark Dankoff, your thoughts on that as concerning the sobriety of society and maybe a little bit of bounce back from the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s?
Well, it seems that maybe there's been some bounce back, but I don't think that we're going to return to an earlier pre-Enlightenment understanding of these things. And this kind of gets into something that I wanted to ask Dr. Jones about in terms of trying to get at the bottom of what has really happened in our society, and as it seems to be happening elsewhere around the world. Dr. Jones, I have been reading not simply your speech in Houston, but also your Don't Ask for a Raise Either essay in your Culture of Death Watch in your February edition of Culture Wars. And you seem to pin this down in terms of some specific people representing a specific group that have had a disproportionate role to play in bringing about what has happened in American society. You go on to indicate that these same people are bringing this to bear in the Middle East. I noticed in Houston that you cited this March 30th, 2002 incident where Israeli military forces that occupied Ramallah in the West Bank began to transmit pornography over 2 or 3 different Palestinian television stations. And you also cite in your speech in Houston on January 12th of that year, 2002, that the Islamic Association for Palestine news agency ran an article claiming that, quote, representatives of the Central Intelligence Agency and the Israeli Shin Bet have recommended that the relatively conservative Palestinian society be flooded with pornography, drugs, and gambling in order to keep Palestinian youths away from joining the resistance against Israeli occupation and apartheid, unquote. And then later, in this same speech that you gave in Houston, Doctor, you indicate that the forces that were targeting Roman Catholicism in the 1960s are now targeting the Islamic world. Can you kind of pull some of this together for us?
Yeah, there was an audience of Catholics and Muslims that I spoke to in Houston. And every time you give a speech, you think, now what can I talk about that's going to walk into a room full of total strangers and go from 0 to 60 miles an hour about the most controversial and taboo topic in the world right now. But you're right. The premise of this talk was that basically what happened in Ramallah in 2002, when the Israelis took over the TV stations and broadcast pornography over them, had a long history, and it goes back to what the Jewish Catholic Kulturkampf or culture war that took place for 31 years in the United States from 1934 to 1965. I'm talking about the battle over obscenity in Hollywood. And I'm saying that in America, culture wars is basically ethnic groups fighting each other. There are 3 main ethnic groups in America: Protestants, Catholics, and Jews at that point when the theory was formulated. And they were in a battle over who's going to control the default settings of the culture. Who's going to be the gatekeeper? Who's going to decide what can be shown in public and what cannot? And for 31 years, the Catholics held the Jews in Hollywood under control. Pornography has always been a Jewish business. If you have that text in front of you, if you find the quote from Jay Gertzman there, the Jewish professor from the University of Pennsylvania, if you could read that, that gets to the heart of the matter, because this is a Jew, actually, whose parents, his relatives, were involved in producing pornography and selling it in Philadelphia, who were arrested, and he watched them be arrested on television, okay, where he says pornography has always been a Jewish operation. And what I'm saying is that the techniques that they learned in subduing the Catholics, in conquering the Catholics in America, are now being turned on the Middle East. And that incident in Ramallah was an example of that. But if you could read that passage, I think it would clarify.
Yeah, I've got it right here in front of me, if I may step in and do that.
Sure.
Gertzman writes, as a result, Jews have been, quote, overwhelmingly antipathetic to the crusade for morality and censorship in the arts and literature. Antipathetic, folks, for those of you out there who may not have a thesaurus with you, means, as opposed to sympathy, where you can sympathize with something, antipathetic means vehemently opposed to it. Okay, so they are, according to this fellow of the Jewish persuasion, Jay Gertzman, he is saying that Jews have, quote, been overwhelmingly antipathetic. He doesn't say that a few of them have been. He's saying overwhelming.
Excuse me, but I think that's Leo Pfeffer you're quoting.
Leo Pfeffer?
Jay Gertz. I think that's Leo Pfeffer you're quoting.
I'm sorry, okay.
The Jay Gertzman quote, I think, comes after that. It's
yes, here we go. Here we go. The ethnic flavor of pre-war erotica distribution is still with us. Although, except for extreme right-wing hate groups, critics of sexual explicitness do not overtly exploit the fact. Many distributors of erotica are Jewish, even though very few sons and daughters of the people whose careers are surveyed here have adopted their parents' careers.
Yeah, that's the quote.
Very interesting.
So, pornography. This is a Jew at the University of Pennsylvania whose relatives were involved in the and sale of pornography, saying pornography was always a Jewish operation. And so you look at it, what I try to explore here is there are various aspects of this, various reasons why you would want to do this. Obviously, the first reason is it's an easy way to make money by preying on people's weaknesses. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying in this talk, and what I think the Palestinian incident pointed out, is that pornography is a form of political control.
Yes.
That was perfected in the United States, and now they're trying to use this to bring the entire Islamic or Middle East under this form of control, as Shin Bet and the CIA already admitted.
Well, you know, fellas, I can remember in the days and weeks following America's invasion and destruction of Iraq, I can remember reading an article that had been penned by one of these embedded reporters who was in Iraq, and it was a woman who was writing, talking about some of the cultural changes that had taken place in Iraq immediately following the American invasion, and I mean immediately, like within weeks or months. The Americans were very careful not to bomb the movie theaters and some of the medical facilities. The movie theaters, which basically you would never find pornography in a Middle Eastern country like that. It was considered contraband. You would be dealt with very harshly if you ever were caught with it. The movie theaters had been turned into 24-hour free porno theaters that men and young boys could go in there in a dark room and watch pornography for free. So the Americans knew. The Americans, of course, being controlled by this Jewish element that was responsible for bringing this war about, understood all too well the value, as you pointed out, Dr. Jones, of making the men who, let's face it, when it comes to fighting wars and building the resistance, it's going to be the men who do it. They understood very well that one of the ways, instead of having to shoot every male in the country, you simply weaken them with something like this. The other thing that this reporter noted is that abortion clinics were springing up all over the place in Baghdad and some of the larger cities, where there had been none before. So what you're talking about here, Dr. Jones, is extremely important for the people listening to this program to understand. It is not simply parking tanks or airplanes or airstrips or anything like that in a country that underscores invasion and conquest totally. It's also putting strip clubs in and all of these things that will weaken the population from within so that they do not want to resist anymore. I was having a conversation with someone last night, and we were talking about the latest celebrations taking place on the streets of America over the death of bin Laden. And this fellow, like myself, was from an earlier generation when, even though we all grew up in the I hate to even say this, the embryonic stages of Roe versus Wade. Nevertheless, there still was more civility to society than there is today. And he asked me, this friend of mine, he said, how can this be? How can you have these Americans in the streets celebrating death like this? And I said, because this is how we are a new race of people, the Americans are, because of what has been done to us through mass media. We have been, all of these things that used to be a part of what we would call our culture, all of the rights and wrongs. We knew what we were allowed to do. We knew what we weren't allowed to do. And those things have been removed deliberately so that a nation of barbarians would be created who would go out and kill 1.5 billion people and not feel an ounce of remorse on it, about it. Dr. Jones, if you would bring this thing full circle for us and explain how this attack on values, pornography probably being the most important of those, how this is being used against us as a weapon of war, and if you would too expand on how this is leading to making terrorists that we have to worry about. The Islamic world, they do not want this. They understand that this is going to be poison for their societies. This is one of the reasons why they call the West the Great Satan.
Well, there's a quote in there from Stephen Steinlight, also around 2002, where he said that MTV, Stephen Steinlight is a senior researcher for the American Jewish Committee. Mm-hmm. He said...
Hello? Mark, are you there?
I'm here.
Okay, so it seems like we have lost Dr. Jones. Stand by, ladies and gentlemen. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Had a slight technical difficulty situation there. We are back with Dr. Jones. You were just saying, Dr. Jones, about Stephen Steinlight. He was about to make a comment about MTV. Go ahead.
Yeah, Stephen Steinlight, senior researcher with the American Jewish Committee, called television the Jewish business par excellence, said that the smart money as of 2002 was betting that MTV was going to be more powerful than the mullahs. Mm-hmm. I don't think it worked out the way they thought it was going to work out.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think it did. I was in Switzerland. I was doing a lot of translating with this group, a group of German psychologists and so on and so forth. They had a guy from Afghanistan by the name of Hassan there, and Hassan gave a little talk about what it was like to be in American-occupied Afghanistan, and he said, either you go to the disco or you go to jail.
Okay.
That's the way he perceived it. In other words, either you go along with sexual liberation and succumb to it, or we'll come up with more conventional military methods to deal with you. I think that's what happened. I think they stayed out of the disco. If you want my honest opinion, I think that the death of Osama bin Laden is another way of saying that the military mission in Afghanistan failed. And this is their way of getting out of Afghanistan. I think they won in Afghanistan. Okay. By this ethnic solidarity. Mm-hmm. Ethnic solidarity based on religious principles. Mm-hmm. I think they succeeded. I think the Catholics failed. The Catholics in the United States failed. They ran up the white flag in their confrontation with the Jews of Hollywood. Mm-hmm. They ran it up in 1965 when Hollywood came up with a film called The Pawnbroker, mm-hmm. which they showed a bare breasts on the screen. Mm-hmm. And it was a Holocaust movie. This is Rod Steiger, who's a Holocaust survivor, and the Catholics simply were intimidated. Like, how are we going to condemn a Holocaust movie? Mm-hmm. Especially when the guy keeps telling me how artistic it is. Between Eli Landau, who was the producer of The Pawnbroker and the head of the Legion of Decency at that time, and the Jewish guy from Hollywood kept saying, "This is art. This will be a great breakthrough for art," and the Catholics couldn't deal with it. Mm-hmm. They were befuddled. They ran up the white flag, mm-hmm. and within 7 years, I'm talking about by 1973, maybe 8 years, three of the top 10 grossing films, first-run films, were hardcore pornography. Mm-hmm. This is not an exaggeration. I'm talking about Deep Throat, The Devil and Miss Jones. These were two of the top grossing films. So it went from 0 to 60, as I said, in 4 seconds or 8 years. And what you had was once they broke the will of the Catholics, they went right to pornography because they knew if they could put on pornography, they could control the mind of their enemies, and that's what happened.
Let's just take a slight detour here, and let's discuss this thing as a weapon of war, Dr. Jones, because, you know, that's one of the things, unfortunately, people such as you and I and Mark Dankoff, we find ourselves, you know, among strange bedfellows, no pun intended here, with the anti-war movement, because typically the anti-war types are left-leaning. They're very relaxed on issues such as abortion and pornography. You know, the general decline of moral values. About the only people we find ourselves being in league with these days as far as these issues go are the Muslim community. And unfortunately, you know, and this is one of the points that I have made with a lot of my people, my friends on the left in the anti-war movement. I said, listen, one of the reasons why you're not succeeding in bringing some of these right-wing Christians into the anti-war camp is because for the last 30 or 40 years you have preached the moral position of slaughtering an unborn child in the womb, of unleashing pornography upon society as being the right to free speech, without even considering the poisonous effects that these things have on society, on solidarity, on people being able to think clearly. Okay, so that they can make informed decisions about whether or not it's a good thing to invade another country and kill 1.5 million people. So if you would, Doctor, can you comment on that a little bit as a weapon of war, this issue of pornography and basically a relaxing of values, expand on that a little bit in the way that you did your speech in Houston.
Well, I said if you look at the contemporary explanation of pornography, it is totally inexplicable, because pornography means freedom. So if pornography means freedom, that means the Israelis were bringing freedom to the Palestinians. Well, nobody believes that. Mm-hmm. So in order to understand it, you have to go back to a classical understanding of what we're talking about here. And one of the good places to start is Samson and Delilah. Samson was undefeatable in battle. He was, you know, the Israelites at that time could not be defeated by the Philistines, and so they decided, well, we'll use psychological warfare in terms of, this will be a way of defeating him. And so they got this good-looking lady by the name of Delilah, and she seduced him, and she cut off his hair. And the symbolism that's especially important is they put out his eyes. Mm-hmm. They blinded him. And that's what that's what I was trying to say to this audience. Lust makes you blind.
Yes.
This is exactly what Thomas Aquinas said in the Middle Ages, some 1,000 years after the story was originally written. Lust makes you blind. Well, if you're blind, you're not a good opponent in war. Mm-hmm. And that is the whole point of this thing, mm-hmm. to use what we saw over the course of the Enlightenment, let's say from the Enlightenment, beginning with someone like the Marquis de Sade, who used pornography as a weapon. There's no question that pornography produced in the Palais Royal brought down the House of Bourbon and gave us the French Revolution. Mm-hmm. There's absolutely no question. Mm-hmm. It was part of that. Mm-hmm. This was the first real beginning of pornography. It was political in its use from the beginning, and it's never changed. Mm-hmm. We're not talking about, individuals look. We're talking about a government permitting it. Why does a government permit it? Why does a government ban it? The government permits it because they want it to be used as psychological warfare against their own population to keep them docile. And then when they become an imperialist power like the United States, mm-hmm. and they conquer other people, this is a way of keeping conquered peoples docile. Mm-hmm. Augustine said it in the City of God. A man has as many masters as he has vices. Mm-hmm. And so you can blind the population. That's why what you were saying, that was the purpose of what you just said about Iraq. All these people are conquered people. How do you keep them conquered? Well, put pornography in the movie theaters.
Yes.
And you blind them, and that's the end of resistance.
Okay, let me ask you this, Doctor. Somebody who would be, let's say, take a more relaxed view of this issue of pornography, they would say, well, Doctor, okay, what is your position here for saying that this is going to make society docile? If you would please go through the process. What is it about the science here of pornography that renders people unable to resist? What is it, the toxic effects of it, psychologically speaking, that operate in this fashion?
You're talking about the manipulation of human appetite and human passion. Mm-hmm. They're the same thing. Appetite, passion, it's the same thing. And so Aquinas uses the example of the lion who sees prey, some type of thing that he can eat. He becomes overcome. That's all he can think about. All he can think about is, I want to gratify this appetite. Okay? And becomes blind to everything else. And that's the same thing that happens to a human being when the sexual passion is aroused. You become blind to everything else and therefore useless and therefore docile. And I'm saying the biggest breakthrough in this regard, after Hollywood, the Jews in Hollywood broke the production code, was the use of internet as a vehicle for pornography.
Yes.
Because now it's in everybody's.
Everywhere.
It's in everybody's home.
Everywhere.
And everybody who works now, as I do, I have to use the internet because of my work. I'm working in an X-rated bookstore.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And I'm not supposed to look at the shelves as I'm working hard away at my job here. Well, this is unconscionable. No one has a right to do this to us. But it's been done to us because this country is inimical to the interest of its own people.
Mark Dankoff, you've been sitting over there waiting to erupt like a volcano. What do you think about what Dr. Jones has said here as using pornography as not just a weapon against the people of the Middle East, but indeed a weapon in turning us into the shock troops that are designed now to go and make war against 1.5 billion people?
Well, it makes all the sense in the world to me, both between these insane wars of empire in the Middle East and a $14 trillion national debt, and a situation where you've got the crime that we have in the streets and the end of the manufacturing sector of our economy. We're a service economy now. You have a situation where Paul Craig Roberts is saying that the actual unemployment rate in this country is about 22%. And when you really start looking at what is happening to both Social Security and Medicare, as Roberts himself indicates that both of these programs are being robbed to basically pay for these imperial wars in the Middle East, what better way to get a population to put up with the rather lamentable state of our own economic and political circumstances than by creating this hyper-sexualized pornographic society that Dr. Jones outlines for us here. It makes all the sense in the world to me. And one thing that is particularly striking to me, and I'd like to direct this to Dr. Jones if I might, I'm going back to your February essay on the end of Don't Ask, Don't Tell. And you have identified the Jews and Obama's Rabbi David Saperstein and the Religion Action Center of Reform Judaism, an arm of the Union for Reform Judaism, and the Central Conference of American Rabbis, which includes more than 1,800 Reform rabbis, as having had a disproportionate impact in bringing the homosexual revolution into the American military. Now, Dr. Jones, my question is this. Pat Buchanan, as you cite, indicates in the Human Events of last December that this is a so-called Christian rout in the culture war. And yet you, Dr. Jones, say that closer inspection of those celebrating the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell revealed a more specific group of people, one which Buchanan didn't know about or one which he chose not to name. What was Buchanan's reticence on this in your view, and why do so many Protestant evangelicals, and I'm thinking of people like James Dobson and some of the other Protestant evangelicals who seem to be in the forefront of these so-called culture wars when it comes to pornography and abortion, why do they never seem to bring up or to discuss the clear Jewish historic linkage to this problem?
I'm sure Pastor Dankoff has read the Gospels, and if you do, you know that fear of the Jews goes a long way back. It goes back to the time when Jesus Christ was on this earth. The parents of the man born blind refused to speak out of fear of the Jews, because the Jews threatened to expel from the synagogue anyone who said that Jesus Christ is the Messiah. Nothing has changed since then. We still have that dominating us. But to get back to your original point, I deal with this in the Jewish revolutionary spirit. The Jews became revolutionaries at the foot of the cross when they rejected Jesus Christ. There's never been enough of them to have a revolutionary movement after, let's say, after Masada, after the fall of the temple. They always need an avant-garde, or they are the avant-garde. They always need troops to carry their cause forward. And so for 60 years in the United States, it was the blacks in the southern states that they tried to turn into revolutionaries. And they succeeded at the time of the Black Panthers, and then that whole thing went bust. And around the same time, they changed and they created the homosexual as the revolutionary avant-garde. And that's where it stands right now. The homosexual movement is, as I pointed out in that article, as Rabbi Saperstein made very clear in his pleading for the abolition of don't ask, don't tell, the homosexuals are the revolutionary Jews' current avant-garde to engage in the sexualization and social engineering of our culture.
Yes, and one of the things that you point out in both of these articles is that when you have the legitimization of sodomy as being the equivalent, the moral equivalent of marriage, you're denying nature, you're denying natural law, you're denying moral order, you're denying a difference between right and wrong, then ultimately force is the only rule of action, you say, once you get to the end of this ongoing development. This seems to have a lot of implications both for American culture domestically as well as for American foreign policy. This business of utilizing force that is not rooted in natural law or moral order any longer. How does this play out?
Right. Well, there are only two choices. Either there is a moral order which we all have to conform to, or there's no moral order, in which case the powerful and the wealthy can do whatever they want. And what we're seeing with these people, what we're seeing now with our gangster foreign policy, where people can just fly into another country, break down the doors of someone's house, start shooting people, whoever's there, I don't know, innocent women and children, and they take the body of someone they're claiming it was Osama bin Laden and drop him in the ocean. That's not compatible with rule of law. That's not compatible with the moral order. That's all force. That's video games. That's pornography. That's the rule of force. And that's not compatible with anything civilized. Mm-hmm. And that's where and I'm saying the steps along the way were the breakdown of the moral fabric of this country's citizens. Mm-hmm. And the battering ram of the 60s was sexual liberation, in pornography in particular.
You know, Dr. Jones and Mark, one of the things that I find not just mind-boggling but really just absolutely maddening is dealing with the supporters of Israel from the Christian community. The same Christian community who's constantly championing family rights, the right to life, marriage between a man and a woman, and yet when you bring up this topic of who is responsible for having shoved abortion down the throats of Americans, pornography and all of the rest of this stuff, they suddenly turn a blind ear to all of this. And then you point out the fact that the Muslim community, the same community that these Christian evangelicals who are so enamored with the Jewish community and with Israel, that this is one of the reasons why the Muslim communities throughout the world view the West the way that they do. I mean, let's face it. I hear this from people all the time. Why don't you try to convert the Muslims to Christianity? Why would any Muslim in his or her right mind want to model, reorganize his or her morals in such a way as to become a quote-unquote Christian? Name one Christian country for me where abortion and pornography and these other moral ills are not rampant, and you can understand why there is this backlash against the West within the Muslim community. So how do you explain this schizophrenia on the part of what we would consider the right-wing Christians, that they champion right to life and, family values and all the rest of that, but yet they fail to see that this is exactly one of the reasons why the Muslim world has such antipathy towards the West?
They don't fail to see it. They know what they're doing. Take a candidate like Rick Santorum. Rick Santorum was the the Catholic senator from Pennsylvania. Well, there's a double game going on here. I'm familiar. I know it because I've seen it operate in the Catholic community, where you get some guy who appoints himself some leader of the Catholic community, and what he is doing is basically using the abortion issue to get Catholic votes so that he can get into office and then do the bidding of the Jews who paid his bills by supporting Israel. Mm-hmm. Rick Santorum was a classic example of this. It's not some blindness on his part. It's a plan. This is the whole manipulation of the right to life movement that has taken place for 30-some years now, and the Republicans have exploited this.
Exactly.
And it's time to expose this, because we have to break this logjam. This attempt, this constant attempt. I see it all the time among Catholic writers, so-called these double agents who are paid off by foundations to demonize Muslims. Mm-hmm. It's all bought and paid for. I know the people I know where the money comes from. I know who's doing it. It's all bought and paid for. These guys are all double agents.
Will you talk about that for a moment, Doctor? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, well, where do you think Rick Santorum ended up? Mm-hmm. He ended up at the American Enterprise Institute.
Yes.
Okay, it's not just right to life. It's not just the Jews and Israel they're supporting. It's capitalism. They're supporting that too. Mm-hmm. This is mammon. This is where they got. Now, Rick Santorum used to write for a magazine called Crisis. Crisis was bought and paid for by these neocon foundations to not to promote the Catholic view of the culture, but to get stupid Catholics to vote for Republicans. Mm-hmm. That was the whole point of this thing. It's time to expose these double agents and it's time to bring about some type of reconciliation, eliminate all of these warmongers. Culture warmongers that are trying to divide, because there's three. I don't know what the number is. If you add them together, what do we have? Christians and Muslims. 3 billion people in this world. Exactly. Okay, 3 billion people being held apart by what? By 100,000 guys someplace in Hollywood and New York. Mm-hmm. Well, we got to break through this.
Absolutely.
This is. I mean, we've been excluded from all of the mass media. It's all propaganda. We are the people that have to break through this logjam and say what I saw. See what I saw when I was at the Cairo Population Conference, when the Iranian mullahs said we support what the Pope is doing. We're all against this abortion. We're all against this birth control imperialism. That's what needs to happen.
No, I agree with you. I think that it is the thing that the Jews are the most worried about, particularly, and I don't mean to put my friend over here from the Lutheran community on the spot, but particularly between the Catholics and the Muslim, because for all intents and purposes, the Catholics, even with as much trouble as the Church is in these days, they do represent the single largest block of Christians in the world. They have a hierarchical structure that goes all the way to the top, and so you can see why it's very important that the Catholic Church be corralled in such a way so that the Pope is muzzled on these issues. If the Catholic Church, and especially in the person of the Pope, if he ever did step up to the plate and say, look, all of you Catholics out there, a billion of you out there, you are no longer permitted to morally support this war. And then the Church, of course, could exercise all of the coercive measures that it has exercised in the past to great effect. And I'm not talking about the Inquisition, I'm talking about an interdict and things such as that. And, of course, this is the thing that the Jews are the most terrified of anything else, is that there would be this temporary and very practical alliance between the Islamic and Christian worlds. The Muslims that I know have told me that out of all the Christian denominations, it's the Catholic Church that is the one that is the most, or Catholicism, that is the one that is most similar to the tenets of their faith as far as their reverence of the Mother of Jesus and these other issues. And it baffles them. They don't understand how somebody with as much power as the Pope has, that he could bring a halt to the attacks on his church and the attacks on his faith by simply coming out and saying what a good portion of the world's population already knows when it comes to Jewish power and who is really pulling the strings. So, and just one other thing that I want to insert into this discussion here, and I have predicted this in the past, and I think, sadly, that there's a very good chance of me being proven right on this. ladies and gentlemen, I think that the final coup de grace as far as these Jewish interests go is that they want to see an all-out war between the Catholics and the Muslims, because as Dr. Jones pointed out, you're talking about 1.5 billion people on one side and roughly 1 billion people on the other. And how would they bring something like this about? Well, they would do this through their age-old tactics of, by way of deception, thou shalt do war. I would not rule out for a second them doing something as dastardly as actually blowing up the Vatican and blaming it on Islamic terrorists in order to get this war started. I know that's a little bit off topic, Dr. Jones, but what do you think about something like that? The false flag operations are their sort of the mark of that. That's the way they do business. Whether it would be that dramatic, I mean, that sounds like something out of a novel, but I don't know. Who knows? Who knows? All I'm saying is that right now the Catholic Church is in a state of disarray, largely because of what happened during the 60s. The same people, the Wilhelm Reichs of this world that promoted the sexualization of the clergy, once that happens, the clergy is weakened. We saw that effect. And then the same group of people, the Jews now, are prosecuting people like Lynn Abrams in Philadelphia, prosecuting the priests for acting out what Wilhelm Reich told them to do 30 years ago. That needs to be exposed. The Catholics need to understand what happened to them. They still don't know what happened to them. But what I'm saying here is that it's got to change. We have to come back. This is the bet that I made when I wrote The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, that the current Catholic position is so out of line on the Jews that it has to change back to the traditional position. I was like George Soros shorting the pound. Right.
I knew it had to come back. I knew it was overvalued, and I was proven right. We did an article in Culture Wars. Robert Sungenis did it, saying the Catholic Catechism, the American Bishop's Catechism, had a statement in there, the Mosaic Covenant is eternally valid. We said, this is heretical, it's got to change. And lo and behold, guess what happened? They pulled it out of their catechism. That's the type of change that no one thought would ever happen, and now it's happening. It's got to happen. We have to come back to a traditional understanding of who the Jews were. And this Pope is also spreading all sorts of confusion by writing, private bestsellers under the name of Joseph Ratzinger, rather than speaking as an I instead of a we. And he's calling all sorts of confusion. But he's not going to live forever, and we're going to get a new pope, and I think we're going to come back to the traditional position. And that way, that is a natural basis for collaboration between the Catholic and the Islamic world. So we just hang on there. It'll happen.
Well, what do you say, Dr. Jones, to those Catholics who, what I would consider very narrow-minded in their outlook on things, and who do not appreciate how late the hour is and how serious things are? What do you say to those who would say, "Oh, we're not allowed to be rubbing elbows with the Muslims, the Mohammedans. That's ecumenism, and we are forbidden from doing things like that." What would your response to something like that be?
Well, who said it's forbidden? Who said that? That's preposterous. It's simply not true.
Well, I have got.
I mean, what is supposed to come out of Nostra Aetate is a kind of even-handed outreach to both Muslims and the Jews. Well, that hasn't happened. It's pretty much all been one-sided. It's constantly, you've got some rabbi, the Pope is always going to some synagogue and sort of grudgingly goes to a mosque every now and then. I think that John Paul II was better in this regard than Benedict is now.
Right.
But in terms of principle, no, we are here to collaborate with each other for peace on this earth.
Absolutely.
We are here to collaborate. There's nothing anti-Catholic about collaborating for peace. And how can you keep 3 billion people apart? When the overwhelming majority do not want these wars, and the overwhelming majority do want peace, and they want a decent place to raise their children that is free of all this pernicious, pornographic sexualization of our culture.
Absolutely. Fellas, I promised to keep you, Doctor, only locked up here for about 45 minutes, so we are going to bring a close to the program. Mark Dankoff, your parting thoughts.
My parting thought is that I'm waiting to see how things develop for Dr. E. Michael Jones in the days ahead, because now that he's on Press TV Iran, as you and I are on occasion, Mark, I think he's going to discover that because of the millions of people who will be watching him and listening to his views and connecting a lot of dots because of the way that Dr. Jones puts things together and communicates them. It's going to make organized world Jewry and the Anti-Defamation League specifically very, very nervous. And I suspect that it's going to be an exciting time for Dr. Jones and culture wars as the increase in international exposure is going to frighten our mutual enemies when they see the fact that Dr. E. Michael Jones, in my view, is going to be a particularly strong component in enabling world Christians and mainstream Muslims to understand how much we have in common in fighting this mutual beast.
Dr. Jones, your last words.
I would just say to the Jews out there, I'm on your side. Be not afraid. It's time to come back to Logos. It's time to reject the rejection of Logos and stop this whole revolutionary experience. That is what the church has always proposed to Jews, and that's what I'm proposing now, conversion. It's time to convert. It's time to give up this nihilism, this failed revolutionary experience. There's no reason to be afraid of someone like me.
Okay, fellas, my parting words, I'm going to quote from an article that was a UPI article, and it's entitled Netanyahu, U.S. Should Attack Iran with TV. Those of you out there who have been kind of smirking at the discussion that took place here just now, at the thesis that war is effectively waged by destroying the morals of entire countries. I'm just going to quote from this article here. Again, I said a United Press International article. Netanyahu, U.S. should attack Iran with TV. Washington, a former Israeli prime minister, this is of course before he became the big cheese in Israel again, a former Israeli prime minister Thursday called upon the United States to effect regime change in both Iraq and Iran, prescribing a military invasion to topple the government in Baghdad and the transmission of television programming via satellite into Iran, where he said the influx of popular culture would prove, quote, subversive to the conservative Islamic regime. Ladies and gentlemen, I would encourage that you look this up. It's a very important article. You've got to understand it's not just the explosive ordnance that we typically view wars being fought, but rather the moral ordinance that is dropped into our lives drip by drip that basically render us unable to fight the more important wars that we must fight if we are going to remain a free and sane people. Anyway, that is it for today's program. I want to thank my two very important and interesting colleagues, Mark Dankoff of markdankoff.com and Dr. E. Michael Jones of culturewars.com for what I feel was a very informative and interesting conversation. And to all of you mothers out there, those of you whose hand that rocks the cradle rules the world, a very happy Mother's Day to all of you, and thank you for the sacrifices that you have brought. Believe me, I've seen it firsthand, ladies and gentlemen. There's no sacrifice like those that are given by our mothers. Happy Mother's Day to all of you out there. And as I am fond of saying, ladies and gentlemen, go out and do what you can to save what is left of this damaged and dying world, if not for yourself, but certainly for those who are going to follow in your footsteps. And as always, ladies and gentlemen, keep the faith.
The fact of the matter is we are coming